welcome all to the sixth annual conference organized by the Global Corporate Governance Colloquium and by the GCGC's member organizations, which are 12 leading research universities from around the world. I'm Henry Hansmann. I'm from the Yale Law School, and I'm the chair of today's conference. Each year, the GCGC, as you probably all know, holds a conference with one of its 12 university affiliates at the campus of that affiliate. And it holds an annual conference on corporate governance. This year, Yale University, acting through the Yale Law School, is the co-hosting organization. This is, of course, just a virtual visit to New Haven, the home of the Yale University, but we hope that nevertheless it's going to be a lively conference, and we hope that we'll find another occasion to get you to New Haven. As compensation of a sort for the virtual character of this conference, we have paired it with a second conference on the history of the corporation. That conference was held yesterday, had many attendees, a couple of hundred, and was, I think we all agree, a great success. The subject of today's conference is, of course, much broader. The papers being presented have been submitted and chosen by a panel of our scientific committee, and thus they have a variety of topics. We've chosen appropriate commentators, we believe, for all of these papers, and we hope you'll enjoy them. And we hope that you'll enjoy the conference in general. I turn you now over to Tobias Troger, who is the chairman of GCGC at present, who will explain more about the organization and the organization of the conference. So I turn you over to Tobias. Welcome, Tobias.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks a lot. And warm welcome also from my side. And particular thanks to Henry, who has been steering the organizing committee of this conference superbly and put together this wonderful program that we will enjoy over the following 2 days, despite all the well-known impediments to this. And Henry already mentioned we should be in New Haven, but we're not. The pandemic still prevents us from hosting a physical event, which is, of course, unfortunate. However, even in this virtual setting, we preserve some of the characteristics of GCGC, because those who participated in the conferences before know that usually about 2/3 of the delegates are heavily jet lagged and very, very tired. And we provide this experience, at least for our Asian participants this year too, because they're headed for a night session. And the Europeans among us also will attend the conference deep into the night. But joking aside, I mean, what this highlights is really a key feature of GCGC, which from its inception has been a distinctly global and interdisciplinary initiative. And one thing that the waning pandemic really teaches us is that this concept has validity even going forward when we're thinking about the recovery from the pandemic, because here, certainly coming out of the pandemic in a sustainable manner is a globally shared challenge, and therefore addressing it in a fashion that also brings together the knowledge base that we all have and makes us collaborate closely is of absolute importance. And here, the idea of GCGC of facilitating scholarly interactions in a network across 3 major continents certainly will prove extremely valuable. And of course, achieving GCGC's mission requires support beyond the cutting-edge input from academics and the sustained commitment of the university partners. And therefore, it is for me to thank our practitioner partners, JPX, the Japan Exchange Group, and Zurich Insurance, who supported the initiative over the past years so generously. And of course, indispensable support also comes from the European Corporate Governance Institute, the ECGI, which coordinates and organizes the activities of GCGC. And it is particularly the untiring engagement of Elaine McPartland and her team that makes all this possible. And without much further ado, I hand over to Marco Becht, who will also give a welcome address and who is the executive director of the ECGI. Thanks a lot and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Tobias. So my job is extremely easy because I merely need to thank you, Tobias, for being a superb chair of the consortium, and to thank Henry again for being a conference chair, and also to thank Ron Gilson, because it was really his idea, and it's thanks to him that we are all here, and also Stanford University, where we kicked this off. And with this, I'll hand straight over to Horst Eidenmüller, who is going to chair the first session. Thank you.
Good morning and good afternoon, all. My name is Horst Eidenmüller. I'm a professor of commercial law at the University of Oxford, and I'm chairing this first session. In this first session, we've got two empirical papers. The first one on retail shareholder engagement, and the second one on the corporate governance of preferences of certain investors. We have got 4 finance professors to educate us on these matters, to which we are looking very much forward. Now, the rules of the game, quote unquote, are as follows. The paper presenter will have 20 minutes to present his or her paper. The discussant will have 20 minutes to commentate, and that will then allow the paper presenter to give a short reply before we open up for questions from the audience and all other participants. The first paper is co-authored by Alon Brav, Matthew Kane, Jonathan Sitnick, and the title of the paper is Retail Shareholder Participation on the Proxy Process, Monitoring, Engagement, and Voting. The presenter will be Alon Brav. Alon is the Peter Joan Richards Professor of Finance at Duke University. And the commentator will be Mariassunta Giannetti. Mariassunta is a professor of finance at the Swedish House of Finance. That said, and without further ado, I'm handing over to Alon for his presentation.
All right, thank you very much. Can you see my slides? Can you hear me? All right, very good. So thank you again for the organizers for having this paper on the program, and thank you to Mariassunta for her willingness to discuss the paper. This is joint work with Matt Kane, who's affiliated at the Law School at Berkeley, and John Sitnick, who is an econ PhD student who's gone on the law job market from NYU School of Law. And I'll try to use the 20 minutes to talk as much as I can to convey what we try to do in this paper that looks at retail shareholder participation in the proxy contest. And so this is my one slide for motivation for what we think. Can you see the slide? Can we see me moving the slides?
Yes.
Okay, good. So one slide just to try to convince you that this is an interesting question to ask, to look at retail shareholder engagement. We have a lot of extensive literature that looks at shareholder engagement and debate to what extent shareholders should engage in company affairs. And most of this research document the monitoring, engagement, stewardship by shareholders mainly focused on institutional investors. And early work was on mutual funds and pension funds, most recently hedge funds. But it's about institutions, and largely because we have reasonably good data on engagement and voting by some of these institutions. On the other hand, we don't know much about retail shareholder engagement, the willingness to turn out, how they vote. And what we do know from simple statistics in the past is that participation is low. Obviously, incentives are not there to engage. Strategically, they might stay on the sideline. They're rationally apathetic. And just to set the stage, again, I'll give you more statistics in a minute. For now, just to fix ideas, think of a typical company. About 25% of its shares outstanding will be held by retail shareholders over a sample period. And so this is a sizable piece of votes, and we don't know a whole lot about retail shareholder incentives to engage, even though there have been recent efforts by the SEC and the NYSE to increase participation. And what we want to do in this paper is to understand what are the determinants of participation and voting, to what extent engagement of retail shareholders mimics the behavior that we've already identified for institutional investors. So if you think about information aggregation, what goes into the vote, we'd like to know more about what retail shareholders do. And so when I think of the goals of the paper, I'll go through three pieces in the paper that we dedicate a lot of space in our project. So the first one is a sanity check. So the first thing that we do in the paper is to ask whether retail shareholders matter. Okay, and you'll see we have several ways of basically asking, if you took retail shareholders out of the voting equation and you let essentially the outcomes be determined by mostly institutional shareholders, would anything change? Okay, do they matter at all to outcomes that we care for? And you will see that the answer will be yes. And conditional on that, we move on to other pieces of the paper. The next one asks, what seems to drive the decision to engage? We're going to use a rational choice framework from the political science to try to get a lens or to try to understand that behavior, what seems to drive participation. And then conditional on participation, we will then ask, what seems to drive your support for management? Okay, and in many ways, when you think of these three goals, again, given that this is one of the early papers to look at sort of comprehensively retail shareholder engagement, I'm looking to see if there's sort of a behavior that would be consistent with what we would expect from a shareholder that cares for stewardship, that engages when the economically they have more at stake, when the firm has underperformed, etc. So I'll get there, but we want to our goal is first of all to see if in fact shareholders behave intuitively the way we'd expect them rationally. And so with those goals, let me tell you a little bit about this data. This data is 3 years worth of data on voting, and both in regular annual elections and in special meetings in the US over the 2015 to 2017 sample period. This is data that is provided by essentially the entity that takes care of this process in the US. So it's a very comprehensive data, and that we show in the paper that we have very high coverage of most firms in the US. It's provided under a confidentiality agreement, meaning that the best that I'll know about an account is her zip code, not more than that. Again, that's going to limit some of the analysis that we can do, but that's again part of the confidentiality agreement. What we do have, however, what makes us think this data set quite powerful is that now I know what you've held on the record date, in which case I know whether you decided to vote and when you decided not to, right? So we have both the decision, the failure to vote, and we observe if you voted, how did you cast your vote? How is retail defined? Retail here in this paper is defined as any account that does not use the online proxy product for institutional investors, okay? It will be the case that, because we have millions of accounts, some of them may be single client or multi-client family offices. Maybe some of them are very small hedge funds. And so in all of the analyses, we also trim or remove, large accounts. None of the evidence that I'm going to show you is sensitive to that. But that's how retail is defined in this paper. And finally, we have all the information about the proposal, the firm name, QSIP, all the typical information that would allow us to link this particular database to the standard databases that we've all used, ISS Voting Analytics, Shock Repellent, the institutional shareholders data, etc. All the standard databases will be merged and allow us then to for example, compare voting by retail to voting by institutional investors. All right, given that I'm limited to 20 minutes, I'm going to give you just a couple of slides on some key commonalities in the data that will show up later on in sort of the more involved regressions, but I think it's good to kind of to give you some idea of what we see even without any sophisticated analysis. And so what you can do in a given year is look at all the opportunities that an account had to vote, and I only observe what you held on the record date, and I'm going to call that your portfolio. Okay, so if you had 4 opportunities to vote in a given year, I'm going to say that you held 4 individual companies, and I can compute a portfolio value. If you sort these portfolios into quintiles, what you have in this paper are some statistics, a subset will be reported in the paper on these portfolios. And so, for example, if you look at number of firms in a given portfolio, you can see that the low account value individuals hold less than 2 companies. These are like the Terry O'Dean, those who are familiar with Terry's work. These are the individuals who have very few companies in their portfolio. But if you go all the way to the wealthier, the higher dollar value accounts, you can see close to 10 companies on average in the high quintile portfolio. Low, account values, and not surprisingly, less than $1,000 for the less wealthy accounts, all the way to $650,000 for the wealthier accounts. Wealthier accounts, unsurprisingly, come from higher zip code income parts of the country. And importantly, and this is sort of the key role that I want you to focus on, because it brings out one feature of the data that is very strong and shows up later, is the voting rate. If you look at the propensity to vote, the propensity to vote increases strongly monotonically from small to high accounts. Okay, so large account shareholders will vote 5 times as more frequently, 15% relative to 3% relative to low account shareholders. So, strong increase in participation, presumably when you have more at stake, when you have more wealth at stake. Okay, that's one feature that is important that will show up later. The second piece of information that I think is very useful to get at this point is to look at participation. And so there are 2 ways by which we can report on participation. One way is to say, well, out of all the votes that retail shareholders own, how many of them are cast? And here you find 32%, and this is roughly the figure that we've known from earlier anecdotal evidence on retail shareholders, and 32% of shares are cast, and about 76% of shares voting side only with management. But you don't have to weigh in this manner. What you could also do is give, if you're interested in account behavior, you may want to give every account an equal weight, okay? And so if you give every account an equal weight, now you find that only 11% of accounts participate, 1 out of 10. And when you weigh by account, you can see the support for management is lower. It's at 59%. What this very simple table tells you is 2 things. It's a combination of wealthier accounts participate more often, wealthier accounts own more shares, okay? And wealthier accounts side more with management, okay? So 3 pieces of information that bundled together explain what we see in this table. Again, higher propensity to engage by wealthier accounts own more shares and tend to side with management, okay? These are 3 commonalities that will show up later. Okay, so 3 pieces in the paper. The first part is what I call the sanity chat. I want to convince myself that it makes sense to look at retail shareholder voting. And so I want to just describe set of analysis that we conduct to ascertain, or at least try to convince ourselves that retail shareholders kind of matter to voting outcomes. And there's 3 ways by which you can do it, at least 3 ways. One way by which you can ask whether retail shareholders matter is to essentially, quote unquote, kill them, remove them altogether, set their participation to 0, and ask, what would happen then to voting outcomes if you allow only institutional shareholders to vote? Would it be the case that some proposals that pass now fail, some that fail now pass? And you can run this exercise, this counterfactual exercise, by, say, for example, removing the big 3 institutional investors and ask again, would there be any change in outcomes? And look at the frequency of changes. Are they roughly comparable? Okay, so that's one way, by essentially pushing on this participation margin. Another exercise you could do to see if retail shareholders matter is actually to ask, take a company that has had a lot of, whose retail shareholder ownership is high, and ask, what would happen if its retail share ownership would decline back to the low, the grand average of all retail share owners? If you're a CEO and you're thinking about some mean reversion in retail share ownership, what would happen if you revert back from high ownership to the typical median ownership? What would happen to outcomes? That'll be another way to assess whether support would change as ownership changes. And finally, what you could do is to fix participation, but then ask, take the retail shareholders and say, suppose that you endow retail shareholders with the voting preferences of the big 3 institutions, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. What would happen then? What would happen in close elections? Would it be the case that some past proposals would fail, the other way around? And you can run again this exercise for other shareholders. So under each of these possible tests, when you run these counterfactuals, you find that the importance of retail shareholders is just as large as that of other institutions we care for, in particular, say, the passive 3 large institutional shareholders. So to us, the conclusion is that they do matter, okay, whether matter for good or for bad, right? This is not a statement about whether participation, information provided by shareholders is good in any way, but just shows that they move the needle to the same degree as other shareholders. Okay, the next part of the paper, what I would consider probably the most important part of the paper, is about the decision to participate. And again, what I'd like to do, given the limited time, is just to describe the framework, the questions that we ask, and what do we see in the data. So we need a way to look at the data. We need a lens, and the framework that we adopt is one that has been used for several decades in the political science to think about the utility from engagement. And the utility from engagement, you can think of it as having sort of 3 pieces. The first piece is essentially a product of the probability of the shareholder being pivotal times the benefit in utility terms from her preferred proposal passing rather than failing. And you can see already that in both of these terms, for example, the stake size will be important. The larger is my stake size, the more likely that I'm pivotal. The larger is my stake size, the larger is utility gain if my preferred proposal passes, okay? Utility from participation obviously also depends on the cost from participation. This is going to be important because we have data on that allow us to generate variation in the cost of participation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And finally, it may be the case that you choose to participate because, for example, you derive utility from providing some civic duty to engage in voting, okay? This is what we call the consumption benefits for voting. And again, we'll try to provide some evidence whether it's the case that some shareholders engage, even though they're not pivotal, even though for some of them, they derive utility from engagement. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. That's the framework. And there's essentially 2 sets of questions that we try to provide some evidence on. The first set of tests is, again, leaning on that framework to ask, is it the case that when your stake size is larger, your propensity to engage increases? And again, coming to this data, we don't know what to observe, given that there's been this common caricature of retail shareholders as being apathetic, perhaps not even not rational at all. Is it the case that when you have economically more at stake, you tend to engage more often? What is the shape of the relationship between turnout and stake size? Is it the case that when the benefit of winning is higher, again, proxied by, is the firm underperforming? The idea that when the firm has underperformed, perhaps then the economic gains are larger. So I'm gonna describe in a minute what we observe with these tests. And then there's a second set of tests that again get to these two pieces of our framework. And what we ask is it the case that when we know for sure you're not pivotal, right? Either because the company is already owned by a majority shareholder that has more than 50%, or you just have, small amount of shares. Do we see some shareholders for which D is greater than C? Yeah. Is it the case? I'm not going to talk about this, but we can talk about it during the discussion. We try to provide some correlational evidence on the idea that is it the case that the propensity to engage in our elections is correlated with the propensity to engage in general elections. In our sample period, the 2016 presidential election was in the middle of our sample. And importantly, and I think I'll definitely talk about the next slide, is it the case that variation in costs affects shareholder turnout? Okay, so those are the two sets of questions, and I'm going to give you just a very quick synthesis of what we observe. We do find that larger stake size in a given firm drives higher participation. This is even with account fixed effects. So I observe your account, and for those companies for which you have a bigger stake, you tend to participate more often. Okay. We observe higher turnout when financial consequences are greater. Again, special meetings, we observe higher turnout. And if you've underperformed, say, as measured by Tobias or ROA, we see higher propensity to engage. Okay, so, I will not take these two results lightly. Again, it wasn't necessarily preordained that we'd observe this for our sample, but we find consistent evidence of engagement, at least for those that choose to engage. For some shareholders, we observe evidence that is consistent with consumption benefits of voting greater than costs, in the sense that they engage even when we think they're surely not going to be pivotal. And importantly, and this is a result that again, I don't have too much time to talk about now, we observe the bundle of information that shareholders receive. And the literature has already documented that if I want to entice higher turnout, I'm going to send you the paper material. If you send paper material, shareholders' propensity to engage are higher. And we know there's some papers that point out to the fact that in close elections, management actually tries to reach out to shareholders. And one way to do it is with sort of sending them materials. The advantage of our data is that we not only observe the bundle of material, we observe the manner by which you prefer to vote. Are you a shareholder that likes to vote by telephone or mail, or are you comfortable going online? Right? Are you going to navigating online to the correct website and vote there? And what we observe, and this is important, is that when it is the case that I make it much more costly on you to engage, when you, for example, prefer to vote by mail, and now I've shifted and forced you to vote by going online, this is where we see a big decline in participation. Some shareholders, once you take away their preferred voting method, are not going to engage. Okay, and I want to conclude by telling you, again, I know I'm probably running out of time, a little bit about what happens for those shareholders where we condition on participation. What do we observe? We observe, just like before, where performance was poor, I see higher propensity to turnout. Conditioning on turnout, management is going to receive lower support if the performance has been poor. There's been a lot of research, recently looking at ISS and ISS recommendations, how causal they are for institutional voting. We don't think that retail shareholders observe ISS recommendations, but we can definitely look to see if there's commonality in how the recommendations correlate with retail shareholders voting. And what we observe is that what it looks like when ISS says vote against management, retail shareholders' propensity to vote against management increases in the sense that they might observe the same type of information. Those correlations are an order of magnitude lower than that of institutions. So even if you take the wealthier account holders in our sample, okay, those that presumably have access to a lot of information, a lot of good advice, their co-movement with ISS recommendations is very low. Okay, so maybe they have different models for how they interpret the data, different sources of information. So if you think again of information aggregation, of trying, if you think retail shareholders' information is valuable, it doesn't correlate much with that provided by ISS. And I've already pointed to this in the descriptive statistic. Small shareholders differ from large shareholders. Small shareholders are going to be more likely to oppose management. They're more likely to support ESG type proposals. Certainly, they don't participate as often. There's many more of them, but when they do participate, they're not going to be as supportive of management. And finally, when we look at exit, you find that shareholders exit when they vote in opposition of management, particularly in director elections. Okay, I'm going to conclude because I think I'm out of time, and let me essentially focus on this last point. At least the evidence that we find for the shareholders that do choose to engage is that, unlike this common caricature of retail shareholders as uninformed, apathetic, we observe evidence that is consistent with some monitoring role and the provision of meaningful feedback to firms via the voting process, information that doesn't seem to correlate, for example, highly with that of institutions, and in particular, the recommendations by ISS. And I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Alon, for this very insightful presentation. And also thank you for keeping more or less in the allotted time. Much appreciated. The momentum is already building up in the Q&A, which is good. And I would like to encourage you to put your questions to our panelists. Before Alon is exposed to this avalanche, we'll have the benefit of a commentator. Mariassunta Giannetti is going to comment on the paper. As already mentioned, she's a professor of finance at the Swedish House of Finance. Mariassunta, it is your turn.
Okay, thank you for having me to discuss this paper. As you will see in a moment, I am particularly pleased because I think that understanding the role of individual investors in corporate governance is very important. So what did we learn basically from what Alon presented? Well, Alon explores what are the determinants of shareholder voting, and to some extent how they vote. I learned that there are a lot of individual characteristics that matter. There are consumption benefits that are important. And this is the optic that in finance we have mostly used to explore retail investors. Retail investors have a lot of fluke, behavioral biases, and so on. And this obstination in voting seems to be evidence that they have some consumption benefits from voting. However, these retail investors are very important. They seem to be pivotal as often as the big three. And this is a corporate governance conference. We do corporate governance. We have to understand what is the effect of these individual investors on companies, meaning on companies' performance. At the end, I don't care whether a proposal passes or not because of individual investors. I care whether this is good or not for a company. And this is a hugely important topic. We have seen during a few months ago that individual investors can interfere hugely with external mechanism of corporate governance, meaning that, well, companies like GameStop or BlackBerry seem to have somewhat obsolete technologies. How many of us still use a BlackBerry, right? So we would think that having investors shorting the company was a good idea. Yet, is some retail investors on some internet account made the hedge fund stop the shorting strategies. So we really have to understand what is the effect of these individual investors on corporate governance, because they may affect external mechanism of corporate governance, and this has a huge important effect. Now, the paper that Alon just presented is forthcoming on the JFE. So I want to comment on the specific of the paper. What I will do is I will tell the very little that we know about in the role of individual investors in corporate governance. And I will tell what I would do with the data, what kind of question I would like to address. And the question that I would like to address is not much about some curiosities about what individuals do, but is mostly how individuals affect the corporate governance process. That is what I think this audience should be interested in. I assume that you see my second slide, right? Yes. What is the view of individual shareholders in corporate governance? Well, we all studied the textbook of individual shareholder in corporate governance, and most of the theories that we study would say that in order for external mechanism of corporate governance to work well, we need to make shareholder participation easy. We need to decrease the cost of participating. Okay, so transparency, regulation that make easier to cast the vote, for instance, on the internet, are highly desirable. However, if you look at the news on the internet, and I will show you a couple of newspapers articles in a moment, you see that there is a parallel debate that has less theory supporting it, in which basically we see that CEOs, the Institute of Directors, and so on, complain about the risk that ill-informed shareholder opinions prevail when there are these shareholder meetings. Now, the proposals that Alon showed are voted upon are only advisory, but as a matter of fact, for reputational concerns, directors tend to implement proposals that are passing. So what this voting is very important, and board members, CEOs are concerned about too much participation. Is this just evidence of entrenchment? Well, who knows? The press has two different views. So what you're seeing here is a newspaper article from the New York Times that is discussing the cost of the so-called corporate gadflies. What are who are the corporate gadflies? These are very active individual shareholders. The way in which activism is measured is not much through their voting, because until now, until Alon came up with his new data, that was really a black box. But are individuals who sponsor proposals that are then voted upon at their shareholder meetings. And I will show you in a moment that these individuals can sponsor an awful lot of proposals. So what the Association of Directors and CEOs complain also with the SEC is that this wastes a lot of managers' time that tries to bargain with these individual shareholders, just not to submit the proposals, or and after it's submitted to communicate about what the company is doing about it, and so on. But there is a very different view, and this is what you see in the Washington Post article, that by complaining with the SEC about the cost created by corporate gadflies, big corporations try to silence their shareholders. Now, this debate arrived to the SEC basically 1 year ago, and the SEC website was submerged of opinion. So what happened? Well, in September 2020, at the end, the SEC decided to side a little bit more with the CEO and corporate directors and increased the cost of submitting these proposals. Now, what kind of evidence was available? Well, the only evidence that was available was a paper that I brought with Nick Kanchev that was accepted a couple of days after at the review of financial studies. And basically the ECB reproduced our empirical evidence, basically confirmed our results, obviously citing us. And in the speech of the commissioner, the decision was based on the figure I'm showing you. What is this figure showing you? This figure is showing you the long-term valuation effect of the proposals submitted by these individual shareholders. These are a subset of the guys in the Alon's dataset. Is this a small number? No. In our 15-year sample, individual sponsors submit 35% of all proposals. Okay. And who are the gadflies? Well, we see that some individual sponsors are right to submit 52 proposals per year. To make a comparison, investment companies, BlackRock, Fidelity, and the like, submit at most 2 proposals. Okay. What this figure shows you is the long-term cumulative abnormal returns of proposals that are submitted by different types of individual investors. The dark dots are the proposals submitted by these gadflies. These people who submit basically different proposals to an awful lot of companies in a given year. What you see is that there are negative long-term abnormal returns. Occasionally, these proposals pass and the board for career concerns implements them. But then the situation is not so easy to say, well, let's just increase the cost. The individual, any shareholder submit a proposal must have $500,000 invested in the stock. Why? There are other proposals submitted by individuals that actually produces a positive abnormal returns. There is this cross-sectional difference between good and bad proposals. And you will have to trust me that all the econometrics here are right, but trust me, it has been done. This is interesting for something like Alon paper. Well, there are some proposals that destroy shareholder value and nevertheless pass in the shareholder meeting. So the investor base must be such that there is some randomness in the proposals that pass and then are implemented. So in Nick, we try to explain this randomness looking at the shareholder base. And what we can observe in the shareholder base is the different type of institutional investors that hold the stocks of a company. These are the data that everyone has been using so far. I want to focus on our proxies for how informed the shareholder base of a company is. So first of all, we look at institutional investors of all types. So this includes pension funds, insurance company, any type of investment companies. And generally, investors are expected to have relatively more information if they hold a larger block in the company. So the investor base of a company would be relatively more informed if ownership is more concentrated, or if investors have long holding periods. And what you see? Well, those proposals that we have classified as being bad because they are submitted by gadflies, and more importantly, they on average destroy value in the short and the long term. It's likely to pass in these companies with a more informed shareholder base. We also look at mutual funds that are less likely to use ISS recommendations, and we see that mutual funds that are more likely in the past to deviate from the ISS seem to be more informed, and they also vote against this proposal. So, and we have a different measure of performance of the voting that we try to associate to this information of the shareholder base. So one measure that relies on our definition of what a bad proposal is whether the bad proposal passes or not. We also look at the long-term performance of any proposal that passes. Okay, at the end, we tend to care about shareholder values. And what you see here is that for different proxy of an informed shareholder base, the average quality in terms of future valuation of the company of the proposal that passes is higher if the shareholder base is more important. Now, what I don't have here is this part of the shareholder base that Alon focused on for the first time. That is the individual investors. And what is very important for us as corporate governance scholars is to understand whether this randomness in the outcome of the voting that leads some bad proposal to pass and then to destroy shareholder value is linked to the votes of these small individuals or not. And I think that is a very important issue to study for the future. So the main concerns that we might have, also observing what happened with GameStop and so on, is that individuals don't have the resources or the time or even the capability to be informed about a specific corporate decision. Nevertheless, they do not abstain. So in order to try to understand this, I would try hard to separate from a small hedge fund and family offices, and would try hard to understand whether these individuals are the randomness that led some of these proposals to pass. So another way that to ask the same question that doesn't have to rely on the gadfly proposals as in our work is just to ask, Alon told us that in some proposals, these individuals were pivotal. And if these proposals narrowly passed, I'm wondering what is the long-term performance of the company. So in this way, we not only analyze the individual decisions, but we also say something that is important from the point of view of corporate performance. We say something about the real effect. Also, Alon told us that these individual shareholders tend to leave when the outcome of the vote doesn't comply with their ex-ante preferences. Also here, I would like to see something about company performance and the quality of the proposals. So for instance, Nick and I have a similar results, meaning that these mutual funds that we classify as being informed when they voted against a proposal that is bad, and the proposal nevertheless passes, tend to leave. Do we see a clear association between the quality of the proposal and the individual traits, or are individuals really uninformed in the way in which the behavioral finance work has told us? I want to reiterate that individuals are very important, not only because it's a black box that we haven't analyzed so far and has real effect. They have to vote against management in poorly performing firms. And it's not me that I have to tell Alon that all the activist shareholders in hedge funds, private equity investors, they will just want to target companies that are already doing pretty well. We need some type of shareholders that targets companies that are zombie, they are poorly performing. So we need to understand whether individuals are currently informed, and more importantly, how we can make individuals' votes more efficient. So for instance, Alon told us that if individuals get the paperwork of the company, they are more likely to vote. Are their votes better? And are their votes more different from institutions that are just following the ISS? And here I want to say that on what the ISS advise, there are strong concerns that is something that really fits the company needs. So I really, I am probably out of time. I am not monitoring the chat. But I really think that these data are data that for the first time can help to us to ask this question. I want to understand to what extent the individual contribute without bad proposals or allow bad proposal to pass. And I want to understand to what extent disclosure or even media coverage of the company policies affect the way individual votes and the subsequent firm performance. Thanks a lot.
Thank you a lot, Mariassunta. You are not out of time, you are perfectly in time.
Okay.
So you just used up your 20 minutes. Thank you very much for this. And thank you very much for your very insightful comments. Now I would like to give Alon an opportunity to briefly respond to these comments before putting a couple of further questions to Alon.
Okay, thank you, Mariassunta, for your discussion. I see there's a bunch of questions in the Q&A. I want to basically come back to the point about being informed or uninformed. Remember, one of our constraints is that I don't know anything about the retail shareholders but their zip code. Okay, so it's very hard when you think about proxying for information. And as you know, in the paper, we have a section dedicated to basically testing this. It's extremely challenging because even if I said, let's look at your portfolio wealth and say that wealthier accounts perhaps are more informed, you could easily argue that wealthier accounts, the opportunity cost is higher, so they may want to do other stuff, so they're not necessarily more informed. So it's challenging to come up with a reasonable proxy that you can move around that would pick up propensity to be informed.
But can I tell something, Alon? Sure. For this reason, the same way also for Nick and I, it's impossible to classify the sponsors. That's why I was proposing to look at the outcomes of the voting on the company performance rather than from an ex-ante point of view. And there are methodologies that can let you understand what is actually the real effect. This is also what we do also for understanding whether institutional trades are informed or not. So it's not something that is very esoteric.
It's not esoteric, but I think you know very well that it's extremely hard to do in the sense that you got a few years sample and to look at say ROA, like think of any outcome that you care for, and you want to go out a sample, 2, 3, 4 years, boom, and you hit other issues that are going to make it very hard to look at, the outcome versus sort of, hard to control counterfactual. So I think that coming back to your point, and I think this is what I wanted to stress, first of all, it's the idea that many of them don't participate is consistent with these information-based models where you strategically don't engage, where you anticipate others are more informed than you. I think, and this is where I saw Nadia. Nadia is, I think, one of the participants. And when you think of Nadia and Andre's paper on ISS and the value of ISS, I think the way to think about these results is that we've got a substantial amount of shares held by institutional investors who we know don't dedicate a whole lot to understanding what is it about understanding the underlying companies that they own. Even those that pretend that they do have very small stewardship teams. And so we have many, many institutions who you could easily argue don't have the incentives to be engaged. They have to vote. Most of them tend to follow ISS. And we're saying, look, there's a subset of retail shareholders that engage. They engage when the stakes are higher. Maybe it might be useful to think that their votes aggregated with those other institutional votes might make the vote more informative. Again, because as we said, it's only 1 out of 10 accounts that chooses to vote on average. So I'm with you that I completely agree that we'd like to have more proxies for information. But again, given the anonymity, we didn't want to go anywhere beyond using the zip codes. How do you want to proceed, Horst?
Well, thank you for your answer. What I suggest is this. I'm going to put a couple of questions to you now in a bundle from the Q&A.
Sure.
And in a second round, I'm going to call upon Marco, Nikolai, and James McRitchie, who have their hands up to put their questions live to you. So as far as the first round is concerned, here are the 4 questions that I should like to put to you. The first one is from Daniele Macciocci. Are votes casted by insiders, for example, founders, counted in your descriptive statistics? In other words, could votes casted by insiders explain why wealthiest individuals tend to side with management? This is the first question. The second, by Louise van Marke. It is often said that for institutional shareholders, one of the problems hindering efficient voting is their votes being cast through a sometimes long chain of intermediaries, such as intermediary banks or custodians. Voting instructions may be delayed or may never arrive at the issuing company. Votes may be over or undervoted, etc. Do retail shareholders experience similar problems in practice? The third question from Alicia Ogawa. When you say retail voting, quote, supports management, unquote, is that really an indication of support for management or simply a default response like voting for an incumbent in a political election? It seems an important distinction to make when considering responses to low retail voter participation. And finally, the fourth question by Fabrizio Ferri. To what extent is the retail vote a, quote, decision, unquote, as opposed to the result of management effort to get the vote out, for example, via proxy solicitors? For example, in more important meetings, management spends more on proxy solicitation to get the retail vote out.
Now, you asked me 4 questions, and I'm 55-year-old, and past your second question, I already forgot what was the first, so I'm unashamed. So you'll have to remind me, although I try to scribble down. So the question on who constitutes an insider, of course, this is something that we worried about, because you might have the CEO, past directors, maybe some employees that receive company shares and they vote, and that probably is the case. The thing to remember is that we have hundreds of thousands, millions of accounts. So it's very hard that a few accounts would sway any of our results. And one thing that we do is in certainly all the participation and voting results that have shown, we remove accounts that say higher than $1 million, for example, to try to see if any of our results are sensitive to wealthy accounts. But in the sense that if you have insiders that are not necessarily wealthy, they might be in the sample. But again, it's very hard with that large of a data set that insiders would have a sway on our results. The second question, I know Fabrizio is at the end, that's the, but you asked about undervoting. Here I don't have much information. So Ed Walker and Marcel Kahn have a paper on the pathologies of voting. Here, all the data is provided by Broadridge that handles this data. So I have to assume that the votes that we observe as cast have indeed been cast and counted as so, but I don't have any further information on that. Before getting to Fabrizio's question, your third question was on, can you repeat the third question on support?
Okay, when you say retail voting supports management, is that really an indication of support for management or simply a default response, like voting for an incumbent in a political election?
So look, I think in many of us, Paul, if you think of our decision-making, there's default in the sense that we gravitate to something and we adjust from that. And so on a more fundamental basis, the question is, why is it that we have these defaults? And this is where we try to proxy with that with a few pieces of information that we have to try to get some heterogeneity. So it may very well be that large account shareholders by default are more beholden to management, either because they are management. As I said, I don't think this is the key, you know, a first order effect. But what we try to do is show that if anything, if there is default, this default varies systematically by the extent of your holding. So by default, small account shareholders are going to be more skeptical of management than large account shareholders. But again, I would have loved to have, coming back to what Mariassunta said, we just don't have enough additional granular information on these accounts to generate variation in default. Fabrizio's question was about, he was getting to thank you, Fabrizio, for asking that question. So Fabrizio is pointing to research, for example, by Laurent Bach and Daniel Metzger, by Ilona Babenko and others, that point to the fact that management in close elections in particular is able to engage with shareholders to increase their participation, presumably because they're more supportive of management. Well, let me give a few more details of what we observe in our sample. In our sample, I observe both the material that the company sends you. So I observe whether the company says, here's the proxy material, here's all the 10K, here's all the information in hard copy. Or the company says, here's a notice, okay, you go online, and once you get that information from online sources, you can vote, right? So I observe essentially that variation that other papers have used that allows management to play around with access to information. And again, earlier research shows that when you go hard copy, participation is higher. And that has been interpreted to say, when you get the physical copy, you're more likely to engage. But the other variation that we have, the previous papers did not have, is what is your preferred mode of voting? Are you a person that says, no matter what you send me, I want paper. So if the company says, here's a notice, go online, you may ask no, you may ask for paper. Other shareholders might say, no matter what the company wants, I want to go online. And then there are a third sort of shareholders, they are sort of the compliers, so to speak. They say, whatever the company sends me, we're going to abide. You're going to send me hard copy, I'm going to use hard copy. You're going to send me a notice, I'm going to go online and vote online. And we use that variation to show that these individuals that are essentially swayed by management, what really matters to them is not the hard copy material. If you're comfortable going online, it doesn't really matter whether I give you paper or not. You will go online and you will vote. But if you are like my father, 80-year-old, and you're comfortable voting by phone or mailing in your ballot, and now the company says, go online to this other website, navigate through it and vote, these are the shareholders whose participation declines. So costs increase when your preferred vote of voting has been taken away from you. And by the way, when the SEC was contemplating moving to the notice and access, there were groups that basically warned the SEC that once they're going to switch, you're going to see a decline in participation. And this is exactly what we observe.
Thank you. Now, there are more questions in the Q&A, and a couple of participants have raised their hand. So here is how I would like to proceed. James McRitchie has put 7 questions in the Q&A, and because I'm 57 years old and cannot summarize all these questions, I think it is best if he does it himself. So I would like him to speak up and put maybe the most important of these 7 important questions to you in person, Alon. And then I'd like to call on Marco to put his questions. Now, in the second and final round, I'm going to call on Nikolai Ganchev and Irene Yi, who also have raised their hand. So James McRitchie, there seem to be a technical issue. So let's change the order of events. Marco, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you, Horst. So this is another great paper, Alon. Now, you, of course, have another paper, which is on the importance of having friends to win proxy fights. And I didn't hear you mention proxy fights. And we know that these are marginal voters. And if you think about faculty meetings, to which ones do we go to vote? So in some sense, what do we know about retail investor behavior in votes that really matter, namely proxy votes, ExxonMobil, PG, all this stuff that you know extremely well?
So Marco, great question. I would have loved to have that data, but the provider took away those proxy fights. So, and you can understand why. There's about 30 of them per year. I don't know, they were probably concerned precisely because this is very valuable information for these very close proxy fights. So most proxy fights in this other paper of ours are 50-50. And again, we know on average the retail tend to be pro-management. In the DuPont, that was clearly the case. But again, sadly, we don't have that data.
Thank you. Let me again turn to James McRitchie, if he is with us.
I mean, my questions mostly were focused on, did you look at all where retail shareholders get their information from, other than from the proxy? I mean, like, for example, do they depend on their financial advisors? Did you look at any systems like Moxie Vote, which was a system that enabled retail shareholders to vote through a client-directed voting type system? They could vote like Trillium. If Trillium didn't vote, they could vote like CalSTRS, that kind of thing. Did you look at anything like that?
We don't have, again, this comes back to the Mariassunta's question about being informed. I don't know anything but for your zip code. And so the best that I can do is condition, for example, on your portfolio, how wealthy you are. And so to the extent that you think that those that own $650,000 in account value in a given year are more informed, we can ask whether they behave any differently than those that are not. But as I said, it's not clear a priori. Again, this is sort of I don't want to call it downside, you know, this is great data, but we have to, you know, you have to keep the anonymity as we, you know, it's very important. And so we did not go down that road, although of course this is incredibly important for again, getting to the issues that Mariassunta brought up. I don't have that data. I would have loved to have it.
Okay, two more real quick question. Well, one comment and then a quick question. So the comment that I made that got a couple of agreements or whatever was that when you go to a shareholder meeting now, I present a lot of proposals. I filed 50 proposals this year, so, or actually I filed 90. But they only give you 10 seconds to vote after proposals are presented. So just wondering if that's enough time. I don't think it is.
This is for people showing up at the meeting, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, not very many people show up at the meeting.
Again, we're talking, just to fix ideas. We talk about, for a small cap company in our sample, you have about 5,000 accounts on average. For a large cap in our sample, we're talking 150,000 accounts owning that particular company. And so I don't know that by the sway that this would have, and most of us are not,
Yeah, and then the last, do you have any recommendations?
Look, I'm swayed. I'm of the view that if if you've held a particular company for a while, there's no reason to believe or to rule out the idea that you are less informed than an active mutual fund that doesn't really care one bit about voting and follows ISS. Okay, so again, I turn back to Nadia and Andrei's paper about when ISS, matters or not, because they're the ones who seem to have a lot of sway on voting. But, there's a cross section of shareholders. Some of them are maybe the AMC shareholders. But again, there's a selection here. Only a subset of our shareholders vote. And those that do vote seem to behave in a sensible way. If you told me, that institutional voters were incredibly informed, maybe you then might want to believe that retail should not have that big of an impact. I'm not sure that's the case. So perhaps a bit more information is good.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've got 2 more questions by Irene G. and Nikolai Ganchev. Actually, so our speakers in the next session are warming up. They're getting in shape, and you can hear them speak already now. So Nikolai first, and then Irene with her question.
Hi, Alon. It's great to see how you developed this paper since I saw it maybe a year and a half ago or 2 years almost. So my question would not be about information, but maybe pick up on something that Marco mentioned. So one of the main results, I think, is that individual retail shareholders could be pivotal and basically act as a counterpoint on the effect of the big 3 mutual fund families. But at the same time, one result that I don't think you emphasized is that they don't seem to vote that much in shareholder proposals, especially, and to support shareholder proposals, which are the ones that we usually look at. Marco mentioned proxy fights, but we actually look at usually shareholder proposals. So how do you reconcile these two, in the sense that it seems that when it matters more in shareholder proposals versus management proposals, these retail investors do not actually vote and do not support them?
I don't know how you define matter more, in the sense that I totally agree with you that when James submits his proposals, or whether they be governance or other related proposals, they're important. Environmental proposals are important, but on the other hand, there be some management proposals, say on pay, that are as equally important. So I don't know which way you would say they're more important. Now, why is it that I don't think, my sense is that if you show up, you vote on everything that is on the ballot. So to argue, so I don't know that I don't have I don't see a good reason why there'd be a preference not to, you're talking about participation, you're talking about support. You're talking about support. I don't know. I mean, it may very well be that those that select to participate, tend to, this comes back to the other question, might side with management. But as I said, when the management underperforms, they'll get less of a support. Okay, so maybe you anchor at a point where, remember, there's another selection which we haven't talked about, that there's several layers of selection in this paper. One, I own that stock, right? And so we don't model that selection, but I own the stock presumably because I trust management, right? Otherwise I wouldn't have purchased that. So that selection might already, condition on a set of individuals that are, and this comes back perhaps to the question about being supportive of management. Again, this is the nature of selection that we have to condition on.
Thanks. Final question by Irene.
Okay, hi Alon, this is really interesting, especially given the importance and the scarcity of evidence. So this is more of a comment, and so I explored the relationship between ownership and fund voting pattern like many years ago when I was still a student, and I found a more or less similar pattern. So wealthier account side more with management, even like in the institutional side. So like, and then this holds like, even if you include like many different fixed effects. So I just wanted to bring this to your attention.
All right, definitely we'll look for it. Absolutely.